Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and I'm excited to be starting a new series on young chess players who are crushing it at their age and have all the skills to be the next big thing in chess, and definitely one day to challenge for the World Championship. Today we're going to be looking at Vincent Keymer. He is our first because he is a 14-year-old who plays beautiful chess. He's an international master from Germany. If you're not familiar with him, just 4 years ago, 2015, he was on the cover of a German chess magazine, and they said he was the best talent they've seen since Lasker. And Lasker was German world champion for 27 years, the longest reign of a world champion in chess. So those are some big words. Just last year, April 2018, he played in a tournament, the Green Key Chess Open. He was the 99th seed in that tournament. He was 13 years old. There were 49 grandmasters, and 4 of those were over 2,700 rating. Just for some context, there's only 38 players in the world currently that have over 2,700 rating. There 4 of those players were in this tournament last year. He was the 99th seed at 13 years old, and he won the tournament. The kid is phenomenal, so we're going to be going over a game from that particular tournament. His opponent playing the white pieces is Richard Rapport. He's a 23-year-old. He's currently the 18th ranked player in the world. He's a Hungarian grandmaster. He was the Hungarian chess master in 2017. Phenomenal player in his own right. But on this day, last year in April 2018, he did run into the 13-year-old Vincent Keymer, who just could not be stopped in this tournament. So we'll go ahead and get into it and watch this young master do his work. Game starts out with d4, and then d5, c4, e6. So getting into the Queen's Gambit decline line. Bishop g5, pinning the down. Bishop e7. Just defending against that pin. E3 here, just solidifying the pawn chain. Many times you'll see knight to f3, but instead we just see e3. Pawn h6, forcing the bishop to come back here to h4. Castle on the king side, rook to c1, just centralizing a little bit. Knight to d7, just protecting this. May not want to defend with his bishop here. This also just opens up the door if he wants to get his knight involved into the game. In the Queen's Gambit line for black, many times you're not going to be getting the light square bishop involved right away, especially since you have this pawn chain right here, and your pawn on e6 is blocking your light square bishop. After the pawn takes here, bishop d3, pawn c6, solidifying the pawn chain here on the queen side of the board. Bishop d3 did have some options, usually seeing knight to f3 at this point, but bishop to g3 makes sense as well. Rook to e8, so there's a semi-open file that both sides have. White has it on the c file, and that's exactly where white brought his rook here. Black has a semi-open file on the e file, and that's exactly where Keymer brought his rook. Get involved into the center of the board. H3 here does block the knight coming down to g4. So just preparing for his king development. He can always play knight to f3, castle on the king side. Bishop down to b4, pinning down the knight here. Knight to f3, getting ready to castle. And then a nice move of knight e4. You can see Vincent's being extremely aggressive here. And this move threatens knight takes on g3. So we know after knight f3, Richard's looking to castle on the king side, but if he castles, that would be a mistake. Knight takes here, pawn recaptures, and the pawn in the center of the board loses his only defender from f3, and he's going to go down that pawn in material. So already from the get-go, Vincent putting a lot of pressure on his opponent, playing the black pieces. So this attacks the bishop, and Richard's forced to play bishop to f4 before he castles on the king side. Vincent continues with c5, and then castle on the king side. Decides that now that his bishop is not pinning down the knight to anything, goes ahead and takes that material. The pawn recaptures. There's no backward pawn here on c3 that black can attack at some point, but white does have the bishop pair, something every side's going to look to have. He can blow up the center of the board, really control the board with his 2 bishops. Black, on the other hand, maybe looking to clog up the center of the board, really control the board with his knights. So with that, I thought he may play c4. Now, if he is focused on c4, the other option that he has is knight to b6. Anytime I'm analyzing a chess position, I always love to come over to DecodeChess.com. If you're not familiar, I'll have a link below in the description. People always ask me what type of software out there is that to really improve my chess game, analyze previous games I've played and see where I've gone wrong or maybe could have gone down a different path. What was my opponent thinking? DecodeChess.com will do all that for you. So if we look, and you can just import different games. So I go to chessgames.com to get a lot of these older games from previous years. So I just went and grabbed the game from here. You can easily plug that in. I've already decoded this specific position, and you can see that there's lots of options. If you look at all the good moves here, we already talked about two of these, knight to b6, c4 here. You can look at some of the things for why it recommends knight to b6. Some of the benefits here, some of the things you could pay attention to in this position. So lots of stuff going on this board state. You can go through the threats, the good moves, the different concepts. All of that is provided by DecodeChess.com in their AI, but you can also see for the entire game where white was winning. That's where the blue line is above, and you can see the shade underneath it is white, and then over time that really transitioned to black having a huge advantage. So while there are a couple options that black has, the best move that it recommends is knight to b6, and that's exactly what we saw in the game. Played knight to b6, just stopping the pawn coming up here to c4. Now the knight does come to e5 here. Pawn f6 says, yeah, you're going to want to head and leave this. I don't want you attacking here. Comes back g4. Did have the option if he wanted to play knight to g6, but did come back to g4. And now we do see c4. So preparing for his opponent to play c4 because he did have that option. Now, one thing that Richard's probably looking at is if he did play c4 right away, there could have been a slew of exchanges. Knight takes here on c4. That's one of the reasons you play that knight to b6 move. After the take right here, you could see the bishop take material. And then in this position, he may have looked at it and said, yeah, I'm a much stronger player on paper than Vincent is. I don't want to exchange all material. You could have the queens come off the board here. He probably, as white, has a slight advantage right now and wants to hold on to as much material as possible. Little does he know he's playing possibly the next Bobby Fischer, who plays an amazing in-game, and he has to be on his toes. So after knight to or pawn f6, the knight's going to fall back, pawn c4, and the bishop comes back b1. Definitely not the best spot for the bishop right here. Vincent continues to push forward, h5, kicking the knight back to h2, not where the knight wants to be as well. And then g5, and this is what I really like about the 14-year-old is he is aggressive. This does allow Richard to come in and take with his queen here on h5. Pawn's going to take the bishop here, pawn to f3, forcing the knight to come back, and then queen up to h7. Now, did not have the option. One of the reasons we saw this f3 move, if he were to play g6, he can't perpetual check his opponent. So he didn't even have that option. King to f8, queen h6, king to e7. So he can't draw the game if he wanted to. So after that pawn f3, the knight comes back to d6. We see queen up here to h7, king f8, and then h6. Just can't really do much. King e7 comes up here to g7, and then this is another spot where there's a couple options as far as what black's going to do. And honestly, both of them look intriguing. We have knight to f7 here. This blocks a lot of the threats. The queen's not going to be coming around here anytime soon. The knight's going to take a couple moves for it to get involved and really attack the king. But then you also have a very central knight, which you can use to attack your opponent at some point. King to e6 is another option, but it looks dangerous. Getting your king more centralized when your opponent still has his queen is always dangerous. Now, if we come back over to DecodeChess.com, look at this position after queen g7. You can see that the computer recommends king to e6. Now, it does have two options here to analyze. Both king e6 and knight to f7 are viable options, but you can see that it's a better move for king to e6. Some of the reasons for that, you can also look at the alternative and see what would happen if it plays knight to f7, but the preferred move is king e6. And that's exactly what Vincent does. Now, he doesn't have this software as he's playing, but it's always good to see how these top-level players are analyzing these positions. So king to e6, rook here to e1, exactly what DecodeChess was saying. Rook to e7, attacking the queen here. Queen comes back to g4 check. Pawn f5, bishop takes here. Now the knight can take on f5. Queen comes up here to g6, now forcing the king to move around a bit. And after a few checks, then we have the queen take on f4. So if we analyze this position right here, look at the material from both sides. White has 4 pawns on the king side of the board that can start to push forward. 3-pawn advantage from his opponent. Now, one thing that Vincent Keymer does have is he has an extra minor piece, and minor pieces in the endgame are extremely important. But White's going to be looking to push his advantage on the king side. Black's going to try to use all of his pieces to his best ability to really put a strong attack on his opponent and never give him the opportunity to even push his pawns. Now we see the bishop get involved into the game with bishop b6. Pawn e4 trying to blow up the center of the board. King g8, just starting to attack the king side of the board. You can also see the threat of bishop takes here on h3. The pawn can't move because it's being pinned down, so that would just be a free pawn here. The queen's forced to come over here and protect this pawn right here. King to c7, recognizes they want the queens up here. If he does move the bishop, he doesn't want his king under attack. That would be an illegal move. So wants to get the king out of harm's way, and that's exactly what White does as well. Bring his king over here. Just doesn't want to have to deal with the threat of bishop coming down here and the queen just eyeing down on this g file. Rook to f8, getting it more involved into the game. Rook to e2, rook to h7, attacking the queen. Queen comes back here to d2, just defending here on g2. White is in complete defense mode right now. That's not what White wants to be doing. He wants to be pushing his pawns, trying to promote putting pressure. Vincent's doing exactly what he needs to do, getting all of his major pieces involved into the game and threatening his opponent. King come back here to a b8, rook to e1 here. We do see the pawns taking the center of the board. Bishop back here to d7. Had some options as far as where he could go instead of bishop to d7. Could have played rook to f7, double up here. Could have also got his queen a little bit more involved into the game. This just incrementally improves his position, attacking some of the center material that White has, but decides to bring his bishop back here to d7. Rook f2 says, if you want exchange. Vincent says, not today, my friend. I need all of my material to attack you. Queen to f4 here. Check. The king comes over here to a pretty easy move. Knight to f3 wasn't doing too much on h2. Does need to activate that material here. Rook to f8, attacking the queen. Queen comes back here to h2. Not a lot of great moves for the queen. Still wants to be involved into the game, but h2 is not where you want your queen to be involved too. Now knight down a4, attacking the pawn here on c3. It's going to be difficult for it to get involved to the king side of the board. You can see right here, d5 is being stopped by the pawn on e4, which is good for White. But now he has to worry about giving up material. That backward pawn, we talked about it early on. You want to really lock in that backward pawn for your opponent. That's exactly what that c4 move did very early on from Vincent. Now he can start to attack that. Once he does, he can easily get his knight involved into the game and attack on the king side, or he can just continue to gobble up material depending on what his opponent's doing. Rook to e3 does defend that material. Pawn a6, just make sure that if there's any attack on this back rank, he can always play king to a7, just more of a safety move for him. King to e5 here, and this is tricky because the queen is no longer protecting the king side of the board, and then bishop to h3, and this is deadly because I just don't know if he wasn't calculating right away, but pawn to h3 is not going to work. Rook down here to h3, this is going to be deadly. You already see if the queen comes down to protect it, that's going to be bad. If instead the rook comes over, well, now he can just play rook to g3 here, and this is going to be extremely difficult to deal with. So many different threats. One of the biggest threats is the rook takes on f3, and then rook down here to g1, and that would be checkmate. So from here, maybe queen to d5 says, yeah, your rook can come down, I'll just take your queen. But it's going to be very easy for black to continue, incrementally improve his position, and still put a lot of pressure on his opponent. So knowing that he can't take with his pawn, he plays king to g1, but that's a losing proposition in the end game here. Rook to g7, just adding that double barrel here, attacking this g2 square. Knight to h4 allows another defender on this g2 square. Black, sensing blood in the water, plays rook takes on f2, starting to gobble up material. After the king takes, rook comes down to g2, knight takes, but the queen takes and just has a huge attack right here. Queen down to f1, check. Bishop to g4, and this is threatening queen over here to g1 or d1, checkmate. King to e8. It's always funny when these small little moves that these players play, 15 moves ago, come back and do exactly what they wanted to do. He knew at some point he may have to bring his king to a7. That's exactly what happened here. He does lose his knight here on a4, and this also protects this d1 square. So that's exactly what he wants to do. But unfortunately, queen to f2 is too much. This pawn here on c4 still doing work. Can't bring his king here. His rook is going to fall, and the king is pretty safe up here on a7 and can't get that perpetual check that he would like to stay in the game. So at the end of the day, Richard decides to go ahead and resign. Vincent went on to win not only this game, but the tournament. That really put his name on the map here. Now everywhere he goes, people recognize, okay, that was the 13-year-old that took down a tournament with 49 grandmasters, and 4 of those being some of the top 40 players in the entire world. So really fun to analyze this game. We will be looking at another game from Vincent Keymer in the future, just because I really enjoy the way he plays. He's all out trying to win these games. Not a lot of playing for draws, which is really fun. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game. If there's another young player, could be American, could be international as well, let me know if you'd like me to analyze some of their games and just do some commentary on them as a player, what they've achieved in the past, just to get their name on the map for more and more people to recognize them. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.